So the Snow White live-action remake is a musical fantasy movie based on the 1937 classic Disney animation Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which in turn is based on the 1812 fairy tale. Now, this modern reinterpretation could have been really interesting in terms of how it looks at the main storyline beats. For example, how Universal's Snow White and the Huntsman did, in terms of turning that movie into an epic action adventure. And actually, I still think that movie is really, really decent. But unfortunately, over here, it just came across as being unfinished and really, really lame. I mean, firstly, they completely removed any concept of a prince being in this movie, and at first, they removed all of the dwarves and replaced them with 7 bandits, following Peter Dinklage's comments in terms of saying the dwarves in the fairy tale are really backwards. And they also just removed intrigue and depth where they could have and should have really had it. For example, with the evil queen's motivations, and where on earth does this magic mirror come from? And the palace itself felt really, really empty, not only when the evil queen was in there, it just kind of, like I said, felt unfinished. And shows like One Piece really do show how you can create so much power and presence and character with inanimate objects like a building and a fantasy-based palace, but it's such a shame that they didn't do that over here. Contrastingly though, I feel like the enchanted forest itself did look really, really magical and did really feel like it's coming to life when all of the animals are just running all over Snow White. And then there was very little to no chemistry between pivotal character roles where they really needed to be. For example, you could not feel any charisma or even any hatred really between Snow White and the evil queen. It just felt so empty and hollow, but in the worst way possible. I know it's easy to dismiss this as saying, you know, the evil queen is so evil, so how can you have a relationship with her? My response to that is, when there's evil characters with protagonists and antagonists, this is where you can really focus on bringing that relationship to life and just create tension and have a fractured relationship between the two parties. But as a result of what you're seeing on screen, you just cannot connect to the hatred between these two parties. And very similarly, there was little to no chemistry between Snow White and Jonathan. It's built up in a way that you're really supposed to be rooting for these two, and also they're supposed to be star-crossed lovers in terms of Jonathan gives her the true love's kiss. By the way, what was the point of Rachel Zegler moaning about this movie not needing to have true love's kiss? They absolutely added this scene in the reshoots. But anyway, I feel like they just could have done so much more with this relationship so that you're really supportive of them, and then when their big reunion moment does happen on screen, you're just so euphoric for it. There are certain movies that you can just really tell that it's gone through the reshoots process. As this movie, you can just tell that it's got bits from the previous original footage recording, and then all of the reshoots just trying to slot everything into place, and it just comes across as so disjointed. So let's go through all of the main players now. So Rachel Zegler, despite all of the controversy that she goes through, I do actually think she's incredibly talented as an actress, most definitely coming across when you see how awful Gal Gadot is as an actress. And she obviously has got such a formidable singing voice that every single musical number that Rachel Zegler is singing does come across really, really well. It's just unfortunate that everything around her in terms of the script and the direction ultimately that they decided to go in with this movie just means that you cannot connect with the Snow White character in the way that you should do, as she is such a pure-hearted girl who goes through so much tragedy, and you really should be feeling that burden that Snow White is carrying. But despite all of that, she is still able to come across as being so helpful, so kind-hearted, so nice. And then as a result of all of this, she is such a great role model that you can see becoming the future positive queen. But like I said, because of everything around this movie, it just doesn't allow Rachel Zegler to really shine in this role. And then we have Gal Gadot, who I have supported in the past, but I have to say, her performance in this movie is just so unforgivable and truly awful. I mean, from an actress point of view, she really wasn't this bad in Wonder Woman and in the recently released Heart of Stone. She just could not act in any of the scenes that she was in, and it was just so painful to watch. And I'm just really surprised that the cuts that they chose in the final edit of this movie are the best ones, so I just can't imagine how bad she must have been in all of the scenes that they decided to not put in the movie. And similarly, the takes that they would have done before the ones that they inevitably chose must have been absolutely horrendous. I feel like Andrew Burnap was alright as Jonathan. I feel like people are praising his performance as he was the best part of this movie, and he was decent. I feel like his arc is pretty good in terms of, you know, he is the first person that tried to steal something from the palace and then already has a bit of hatred from the evil queen and then falls in love with Snow White in the end. But they don't really explain anything about this character's backstory, and his romance with Snow White is so forced. You're just supporting it because you have to support it rather than wanting to support it. And how is he her true love? I know that she hasn't really been with anyone else, maybe that's why, because it's the default answer, but I feel like they just could have and should have just done so much more with the Jonathan character, as they could have made him pretty incredible. And then we have all of the CGI dwarves. I don't think they're as bad as I feel like people are criticizing them to be, but it's so apparent that the original vision was to completely change the dwarves and modernize them into these random 7 bandits. So when that image came online, obviously all of the uproar about what have they done with the dwarves led Disney to then create these CGI dwarves, and you can so badly tell as they just have a purpose that doesn't really align with anything else that's going on in this film. For example, why are they so driven in terms of going to the mines? What happens to all of the jewels that they create? If the original vision was truly to have the dwarves in there, they could have interwoven it into the plot in a much more sophisticated way. Is it supposed to go to the palace? Are they feeling really bad now that they know that the queen is actually stealing all of it? Do they have some kind of superpowers? All of those mine scenes were just so random to have in there. I know that they're part of the Snow White ride, but that is the only link because it had nothing to do with anything else in this movie. Like I said, clearly shoehorned in the last minute, and they were just trying to create a couple more scenes with the dwarves. I did like Dopey's mini storyline though, in terms of how he had to find his voice. And don't even get me started on all of the overacting that the huntsman did, and how he was just forcing the storyline on rather than his sequence adding so much value and contribution to the main storyline. So like I said, the biggest crime that Snow White commits is that this movie could have been so good, as all of the storyline beats in this movie could have just been interpreted in a really compelling way, like I said they did with the Huntsman movie, and they could have just gone so dark with the evil queen, but they decided to play some things really, really safe, and just the weird decisions that they made from a script point of view that they ended up backtracking on just led this movie to be so choppy, and you can just see all of the reshoots so clearly. And they should have expanded on the backstory for a number of different characters. For example, the evil queen, why and how has she become so evil? What was all of her dark, sinister plans in terms of wanting to take over the palace? Where on earth did Jonathan come from? Why and how is he Snow White's true love? I feel like they could have just done so much more from a characterization point of view. And then the ending just feels so rushed, so abrupt, and a little bit random. And they could have really dived into the emotion of these characters that are originally farmers that are then forced into becoming soldiers for the evil queen. So much material there to do something absolutely incredible. And as this movie is just riddled with so much controversy, for example, the political views of Gal Gadot and Rachel Zegler, and then all of the interviews that you can really tell Rachel Zegler had zero media training for, coupled with the fact that the end product is really, really disappointing, and if anything, is a bit of a blueprint on things to avoid when you are creating a big motion picture, has led Snow White to not be that great of a movie, which, like I said, is just such a shame. But for all of the reasons that I've explained in this review, I'm going to give Snow White a 3 out of 10. Now I'd love to hear from you. What did you think of Snow White? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video.